Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to the first GTAP virtual seminar of 2023. I am Erwin Corong. I will be moderating this webinar on estimating non-tariff barriers or non-tariff measures and approaches to modeling non-tariff measures based on two papers that were recently published in the Journal of Global Economic Analysis. We have three speakers today. In this webinar, we have three speakers. The first one is Anna Strutt, who's a professor in the Department of Economics at University of Waikato in New Zealand. She will be followed by Terry Walmsley, who's an assistant professor in the practice of economics in the Department of Economics at the University of Southern California, and director at Impact Econ, a company that provides economic analysis for various national and international organizations. And then the third speaker for our webinar today would be Alex Kravchenko, Economics Affairs Officer at the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific in Thailand. Anna will start us off by providing a brief preview of the presentations. Terry will then follow, who will present on approaches to modeling non-tariff measures, and then Alex will also present the new price bilateral ad valorem equivalent estimates in R. Anna?
Thanks so much, Erwin, and thanks to everyone for joining us today, either online or those people who are watching the recording later. It wasn't very easy finding a time slot to accommodate speakers in Indiana, Bangkok, New Zealand, and Los Angeles, but we offer our apologies to our friends in Europe for getting the short straw on this time. We've had a few tech issues today, myself included. Alex still hasn't joined us at the moment, but we're hoping that he's going to join in. He was expecting to join from Bangkok, but he's actually in Georgia, where it's 4 a.m. in the morning. He's assured me he's up, but we're just waiting to see if there's some tech reason. So hopefully Alex will join us shortly and we'll present second. There's been a lot of increasing interest in non-tariff measures, or NTMs, in recent times, with evidence emerging that NTMs may have a more significant impact on trade than the tariffs that policymakers and researchers have traditionally focused on. But NTMs are quite tricky to model. Appropriate rules and regulations bring important benefits that can help to support trade, but NTMs may also restrict trade, and lots of us have faced challenges in trying to appropriately model the impacts of changes in NTMs, for example, as part of a trade agreement. So in today's seminar, as Erwin said, we'll be presenting two papers. We hope they make useful contributions in this space. Both were recently published in the Journal of Global Economic Analysis, or JGEA. I was a contributing author on both, but we're really fortunate today to have the lead authors presenting each of the papers, or we hope Alex will be along to present the second paper as well. We'd like to thank the JGEA for publishing these papers that we do hope make useful contributions in this area. Particular thanks to Tom Herschel, the handling editor for both of these papers. His efforts are really appreciated. And when we proposed presenting both of these papers in one session, Tom enthusiastically agreed. He noted that presenting just one of these papers will inevitably lead to questions about the other. Okay, so the estimates are good, but how do I incorporate them into the model? Or from the other side, great to have the modelling, but where do we get the NTM estimates? So thanks very much for your support, Tom. And we'd also like to thank the anonymous reviewers of both papers who, in, I think, the true spirit of JGEA, worked through the papers and replication exercises in great detail. They provided lots of robust comments and suggestions that led to substantial improvements in the final published papers. We know how much time and effort goes into this type of reviewing, and we're very grateful. Thanks very much. And now I'd like to pass to Terry for the first presentation. Thanks, Terry.
Great. Thank you, Anna. Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Oh, good. Great. Okay. So I was meant to go to go second. So you would have just heard about estimation of NTMs from Alex, but basically this topic is sort of once you've got the NTMs, how do you incorporate these into a CGE model? So to model NTMs, you basically take the econometric estimates of AVEs and implement them using one of three traditional methods anyway, the tariffs, export taxes, and iceberg. When we wrote this paper, we had a few concerns about how this was being done. I guess the main one was, or the one that we thought about was basically there are this wide variety of NTMs which aren't really captured in the econometrics or in the modeling methods. So the econometrics, there was a little bit at the time, but basically they just provided one AVE estimate, which summarized all the NTMs for a trade flow. I was quite pleased to see in Alex's work, he actually does two NTMs, one on the technical barriers and one on the non-technical barriers. But when we wrote this paper, it was definitely just sort of one NTM, which captured everything. So that was one of the big problems. And then even on the modeling side, even though we have three methods, it's very hard to attach them to a type of NTM if you don't have estimates. And then there were a couple of other issues. One was the iceberg method was becoming increasingly popular, but it has issues that we'll talk about as we go through the presentation. And no particular method was available to capture how an NTM might have altered the exporter's production costs. And we felt that that was one of the important places where an NTM might impact a country's productivity. So basically the purpose of this paper was to give some insights into how all these different methods were impacting the world economy and show that there are differences and that you need to think about it. And then the other was to introduce this simple method for capturing production costs. So, and we call that the export cost method or the AXS method after the variable. So we looked at 5 methods. We compared 5 methods. 3 of them are the traditional methods that you probably are familiar with. And then 2 of them, which are in red here, were the new methods. So let me just go through each of these. The first one's the iceberg cost method. The idea here is basically that the NTM raises the cost of the good to the importer. So it's definitely a cost on the importer side. The increases in cost is shown as a decline in the quantity. So the quantity of the good moves from the exporting country to the importing country, and that quantity is declining. So basically like an iceberg melting from as it moves across the world, which is why it's called the iceberg cost method. And a good example of that would be customs procedures and delays, which cause, for instance, vegetables to rot as they sit on the dock in the importing country. The issue, however, is that when we remove the NTM, we're actually reversing this. It's no longer an iceberg that's diminishing between the two countries. The iceberg's actually growing as it moves. So, you know, our quantity of cattle, our cattle are starting to multiply. And if the NTM is large enough, which people were putting large NTMs into this method, then the growth can be quite considerable. And that's the basic issue with the iceberg method. The other method is the export cost method, which was introduced in this paper. And the idea there is that the NTM raises the production costs. So it's a productivity, but rather than it being on the importer side, we take it back to the exporter costs. So examples might include the requirements that wine is produced in a certain way or installing airbags. There's a cost associated with meeting those NTMs. Then there's our tariff equivalent and export tax equivalents, which all of us have used, and these are generally regarded as sort of rents for the importer. We've used them a lot on quotas, licenses, and they're also, the other way that they might be used is sort of an imperfect competition, rents from imperfect competition when you have NTMs. And then the final method we looked at was the willingness to pay method. And basically the idea there is that the NTM decreases preferences. So the example given in the paper was delays in customs for a Christmas toy. So Christmas toys aren't disappearing. It's simply that a delay in customs means that our demand for our Christmas toy would be lower if it doesn't get there on time. The other thing that this method is has some interesting ideas for if you wanted to look at positive NTMs. Example, Georgia has recently introduced NTMs and actually seen a big gain as a result. Or alternatively, again, airbags in cars, they may have a production cost, but they may also be preferred because all of a sudden it's a better quality car because it's safer. So NTMs are a little complicated. They can fall in more than one category. They're not quite so simple as I've outlined, but I'm trying to give you an idea of where each of the methods might be useful. So how are they implemented? So if you look at these, there's clearly ones that are related to productivity. Our iceberg and our export costs of production are about productivity. Tariffs are about rents, and then willingness to pay is about preferences. Another way to think about these methods is how they impact our import demand function. So I have here our import demand function at the top, and these two methods, the iceberg cost method and the willingness to pay method, actually appear inside that import demand function. So it's a simple CES function for import demand. Our iceberg cost appears in the variable AMS, and it has two impacts. So imagine you're removing an NTM. What that does firstly is actually reduces demand for the imports because less imports are needed to satisfy demand. Basically, the iceberg is growing, so you need less of the imports. And then the other effect of this AMS is to reduce the price of the imports and hence raise demand for our imported goods. And as I said, this is a productivity type measure. So this iceberg is coming across as a productivity gain. The second method that's direct is the willingness to pay method. And we've added here, this may be less familiar to you, is a preferences effect. And that preferences effect basically says the removal of NTMs would raise demand because there's a preference for goods. The preferences increase for those goods in the case of a negative ATM. In this case, it's no productivity gains, it's no rent gains, it's not taxes, it's just relative preference changes. But it does directly impact imports. The tax methods, tariff and the export tax that you're more familiar with, they have an indirect impact on import demand because they impact this price. So a removal of an NTM reduces taxes, which reduces this price and increases demand. And we see gains in terms of allocative efficiency, reduction in revenues and rents. And then the final method, which is also an indirect method, it works basically through these prices as well, the import prices, but it's also a productivity effect. So it's similar to the iceberg, but rather than have the productivity gain at the importer side, it's brought back into the export costs. So it has two effects as well. Basically, the idea is that when you remove an NTM, it reduces the amount of inputs needed to produce the export good. And it also, on the other side, it reduces the price of the export good. So one of those, in the second case, you're seeing that rise in demand. When you reduce the NTM reduces the price of the export good, and hence you'd increase demand. And you have, similar to the AMS or the iceberg effect, you've also got these productivity effects in there. Can talk a little bit more about these. So just sort of to think about how the AXS is implemented in the model, think of our exports. We've got 10 units and we're producing them at $1 and we export them to Australia. Australia decides to put on an NTM, which is equivalent to 25%. The basic idea is that in order to produce these 10 units of goods, we now need to produce the equivalent of 12.5. So there's this 25% increase. So in the amount of inputs required to produce these 10 units. So we have 10 divided by our variable AXS. AXS is just this relationship with the NTM, just like AMS has this relationship with the NTM. And then, of course, when we go to sell these 10 units in Australia, we're selling 10 units, not 12.5. So it needs to be, these 10 units are sold at a price of $1.25. So that's essentially how it works. We need to recover our costs. So PMS rises to $1.25. Just as an aside, I guess, if we were to implement a shock to reduce that NTM, we actually need to shock AXS. So you need to think about the shock in terms of AXS, not in terms of the NTM. So if we were to reduce the 25% NTM to 12.5, we need to convert that into a shock to AXS, which happens to be changing AXS from 0.8 to 0.89, or an 11.1% shock in AXS. And similarly, AMS. Okay, so there are our 5 different methods, and what we did in the paper is we wanted to show the differences in results between those. So we looked at the impact of a reduction in NTMs between 6 ASEAN countries, and we used NTM estimates from Webb et al. At the time, Alex's work wasn't available. We used the standard GTAP model and closure, and we look at all 5 mechanisms, and I'll give you the results for 5 mechanisms, but I'm going to focus on these iceberg cost and exporter cost methods so that you can see the differences between those two. So in the first case, we look at real GDP. So these are, as I said, it's a reduction in NTMs in between the ASEAN countries, and we're looking at the impacts on particular ASEAN countries. In the AMS and the AXS method, remember these are productivity changes. So as a result, you see much larger changes in GDP because there's these productivity effects. TMS and TXS, there's some rents, but you don't get the productivity gains. So the changes in real GDP tend to be a lot smaller. And then willingness to pay, you don't have productivity or these rents. And so the gains in real GDP tend to be less still. Okay, so that's generally how things go, except that sometimes it can make very large differences between whether you use the AMS or the AXS method. And an example I have here is the Philippines. So in the case of the Philippines, you see very large differences between AMS and AXS. AXS doesn't give you nearly as much of a gain as AMS. And the reason basically for that is that when you look at the shocks, you find that the Philippines imposes more NTMs than it actually faces. So it imposes more NTMs on its imports than it faces on its exports. And so in the case, so we got a imports, the ones that it imposes are equivalent to 0.507. The ones that it faces are equivalent to 0.06. So what's basically happening is that in our AMS case, the gains go to the importer. In our AXS case, the productivity gains go to Philippines as an exporter. And there's clearly very big differences between what they impose versus what they face. So you're getting substantially less gains if you think about them as an exporter. So that's in terms of real GDP. So it matters where the gains are going. In terms of welfare, you see similar things in the technology. The AMS has a large technological change because they impose very large tariffs, NTMs on, because Philippines imposes very large NTMs. So you get a large technological change, but because they don't face very large NTMs, their technological change or productivity gain, that's essentially what this is much smaller in the AXS case. The interesting thing, though, is that in terms of total EV, there's very little difference between AMS and AXS, and this occurs pretty much across the board. And the reason for that is basically that in the export cost method, you see that even though a country might get some productivity gains, the gains end up being transferred to the importer. So you see a large terms of trade effect, which basically means that the EV results are the same. And then in terms of preferences, in terms of willingness to pay, just mentioning this, you see EV welfare goes up quite substantially because there's a preference effect, which is basically changing utility. Okay, and then the other thing to note about the differences between the method is just in terms of trade. You'll see very big differences between the iceberg method and the other methods in terms of trade. So basically, you can see here, all the other methods have about a 0.01% change in global trade, but the iceberg method, their gains in trade are usually a lot smaller. And the reason is that this is the amount of exports that are being sent, and then the amount of imports that are being received, well, the difference between that is the iceberg. So trade actually doesn't increase nearly as much in the AMS method, which we found interesting. So in conclusions, the mechanism we chose is very important. It matters for the GDP results, whether you impose versus how much you face NTMs will impact your GDP results. In terms of the welfare decomposition, it didn't matter for your total welfare, but it does matter as to whether you're getting direct productivity gains or whether your gains are coming from terms of trade effects. And then obviously for trade, we found, using the iceberg method, trade didn't increase nearly as much. Okay. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alexey Kravchenko, and I'm here to present to you the main findings from the paper that we just published that's called the New Price-Based Bilateral Ad Valorem Equivalent Estimates of Non-Tariff Measures, written together with my co-authors Anna Stratt, Shortip Utakam, and Jan Duval. I'm based in SCAP, which is the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific. So what are non-tariff measures? As I'm sure you're all aware, these are basically policy measures other than ordinary customs tariffs that can potentially have an economic effect on international trade in goods. They include technical measures such as sanitary and phytosanitary measures, as well as non-technical measures such as licensing, price control, and many more. For a very good introduction on this, I suggest you read through this report that we published together in UNCTAD in 2019 that not only explains in details the nuances of non-tariff measures, as well as why many of them are actually important for sustainable development, such as food safety, technical requirements for car safety, and so forth. So beyond looking at their importance, it's important to quantify them to do any sort of type of economic analysis, including through computable general equilibrium modeling. You can't just put regulations inside. So it's important to make them some sort of numbers. As you can see from this graph, tariffs over time have been gradually declining, both because of WTO negotiations, but also because of increasing number of trade agreements. But these are the new notifications of SPS and TBT measures to the WTO, and they have been increasing. And these are just new notifications. That means if you think about the cumulative effect of all of them, it's essentially additive. There have been several approaches of trying to estimate the ad valorem equivalent of non-tariff measures. The most popular is the volume approach by Key and Nichita. The advantages of that is that it allows zero trade because some NTMs can be very restrictive. Generally, they require, however, import elasticities for each HS6 product. They also allow for positive effects of NTMs because, as you may have heard, that some NTMs can actually be positive by giving confidence for consumers in the quality of goods that they purchase. The alternative, and it's a more recent approach by Cadeau and Ng and Gordon, is the price-based approach. The main advantage is that does not require import elasticities, which means that they can directly be imported into the GTAP models, which has their own set of import elasticities, and if they don't match, then the results will be biased. The disadvantages is that it does rely on price data, which sometimes quantities are missing, so there's attrition in data points. Does not account for zero trade because there's no prices for those, and misses out behind the border levies. So basically, the price difference, the CIF and FOB, there are NTMs that actually impose a cost, but that's not accounted in the price data that you can derive from the trade data. However, in general, even though, yes, NTMs can promote trade, in general, any type of NTM does increase the costs of imports, and therefore, this is, as described in more detail in paper, is the approach that we take because we're trying to minimize the cost associated with these non-tariff measures. So the basic model specification that is based on the work of Ng and Cadeau is essentially this gravity equation where we have a log of price, and that's basically value divided by quantity, regressed on country-specific characteristics. The tariff, the lowest applicable one, whether MFN or preferential, pair characteristics such as distance, contiguity, common language, whether they're part of a trade agreement. And then we separate into two types of NTMs, which is chapters A to C, the technical measures, and then non-technical measures. And then we also add product fixed effects at 6-digit level. So some of the technical work there is that because there are significant outliers in the derived prices for whatever reasons, errors, different units, we remove 5% of the highest outliers. And because the data set is in tens and millions of rows, basically the computers that we currently have are not powerful enough to estimate them. So we estimate it at a chapter level. So we have 96 regressions that we run. We assume that negative AVEs are 0 because we assume that any type of non-tariff measure is likely to increase the cost rather than decrease it. We only pick significant AVEs, otherwise we assume them to be 0. And because of the exponential number of the function that we use to derive the actual AVE, we use a hyperbolic function to restrict the maximum amount to 100. And as I said, we combine all technical measures A to C as one type of NTM and all non-technical measures as another type of technical measure. So we get basically two values for each HS codes. We also developed a script to aggregate to GTAP sectors and regions using bilateral imports as weights. So this is the exponential function that I talked about. So that's the you multiply it by the actual number of NTMs. So this is not a binary number as in most literature. It is actually number of NTMs at bilateral level for both technical and non-technical measures. And yes, this is essentially the percentage equivalent effect of NTM ad-valorem equivalent there. So compiling all this data for running this regression has been 95% of the work, honestly. We got the distances, common language, and other common gravity modeling variables from the CEPI data set, GDP per capita from the World Bank's data sets, some D'Souza data set on RTAs, which we have expanded to 2015, Comtrade to get trade unit values as well as trade shares, NTM data. We use the UNCTAD train data. Applied tariffs, we had to combine WITS and WTO data to fill in the missing gaps and try to get the closest year to 2015. We also had to have a concordance of all the data sets for both NTMs and trade data to HS4, that's 2012 version. And we also calculated NTMs for each instruments for each NTMs, which is described in the paper. We don't use it in the regression, but the data set that we have created, and I'll show you in a second, can be used in various ways to estimate whatever you want, whatever your assumptions are. So here's an example of a data set that we have just for one file. We have 5,203 of those files for each different HS code at 2012 version, reporter, partner, product code, quantity token, the price, which is derived through the trade value. So basically you can get the quantity if you multiply it by the other way around, whether they have an RTA, log GDP, GDP per capita, distance, contiguity. Then we also have individual number of NTMs at chapter level. Like I said, in this particular example, we combine chapters A, B, and C as technical measures, and then the rest as non-technical measures. But you can, if you wish, estimate this at a chapter level. And we also even have reverse chapter P, which is the expert one, but we reverse the partner and reporter, which will basically enable you to estimate the AVEs imposed by partners as export related measures the other way around. The final file that has GTAP aggregation essentially looks like this. You have the reporter, partner, sector. These are, as you can see, GTAP sectors, and we have the AVEs and the technical AVEs and the non-technical AVEs for each of the combinations of reporter, partner, sector, as well as the trade value. So the best part about this whole paper is not really the underlying data set that we come up with, but your ability to estimate it by yourself in absolutely any way you can. And let me show you the file, the script, that what it looks like. So this is the resource that I mentioned. If you go to r.tit.org/AVEs, it explains you step-by-step instructions. It gives you all the underlying data files. And I said this has been essentially 95% of the work, is trying to get this data together. And then it goes step-by-step instructions, everything that you have to do. It does take a long time to run because you have to run 96 very long regressions, but following these steps, you should essentially get exactly the same results. And if you don't like any of the assumptions, for example, you don't think about truncating the first 5%, maybe 4%, or maybe 3%, or you think maybe instead of the maximum of 100, AVE should be 150 or 1600, like in some of the UNCTAD literature, you can easily change any of that. You can calculate it at a chapter level. You can include the export control measures, whatever you want, but this will be enough to get you started without having to invent any of this from the beginning. The second part also explains how to fill a full matrix based on the latest GTAP version. Once the new GTAP version comes out, it'll be quite easy to update it, because all we have to do is to change the GTAP commodities and GTAP's region concordance, and that's pretty much it. So after this, you should be able to have it, and whichever way you plug it into a GTAP model, that's essentially up to you. But there's been a lot of questions saying, well, we model NTMs in GTAP. Do we really want to remove NTMs? No, of course not. most NTMs, especially technical measures, are necessary, but they do incur cost. And what we find, and not just us, literature in general finds, countries with high levels of trade facilitation, basically more efficient cross-border measures, even though they have a lot more non-tariff measures in place, the trade costs associated with them are usually much lower than in less developed countries, which basically means that modeling NTM removal through trade agreements or in general is not so much about actually removing those non-tariff measures, but thinking of the ways how to do minimizing costs associated with them. By the way, if you are not familiar with R, there's a link here with a very good resources that we build as well that introduces you how to do trade analysis with R, including building NTM indicators, coverage ratio, frequency index, regulatory index, and so forth. And you can even get a certificate upon the completion of the course. This is an overall result that we have. They are broadly in line with the literature. Of course, it's driven a lot by assumptions and the way you aggregate it, and it's very much trade weighted. The sectors I have put here together are such just because the total trade value is roughly the same, and it shows you, for example, for plants and plant-based products, they're very high. For forestry, paper products, they're the lowest. So again, the resources really to understand this, you would need to go through the actual article. You want to estimate yourself, please use the resource that I have shown you. But if you want to take off-the-shelf stuff that we have already produced with our paper, the results are available under supplementary material with a very short and I hope concise explanation on how to aggregate it based on the aggregations that you run in your simulation. So thank you very much. Any questions, please feel free to reach out to me.
Thanks so much, Terry and Alex, for those presentations. And I should note that Alex's presentation, the recording of it had to be inserted after the live seminar because of issues on the day that Alex experienced joining the seminar. So our apologies for any disjointedness that you might experience if you're watching the recording as a whole after the event. Well, Terry's presentation emphasised the importance of selecting appropriate modelling mechanisms, including considering the new mechanism for capturing the impacts on exporters better. And please do recall from Terry's presentation the importance of appropriately calculating those shocks. But if you believe that NTMs that you're focusing on will impact exporters as well as importers, you'll need to decide how to split the impacts through the different modelling mechanisms. Luckily, some insights into this issue were provided in a paper by Mike Webb and colleagues that we've got noted on this final PowerPoint. In this work, after very detailed analysis by Mike, the finding was that overall, about half of the measures primarily impacted exporters and the other half primarily impacted importers. Ideally, I guess you'd do this type of detailed analysis in your own research, but in the absence of further information, perhaps using this 50-50 split rule and referring to the Webb et al. Paper, maybe that's not too bad a starting point if you don't have a better starting point. The data set of econometric estimates presented by Alex is supported by that online appendix, which provides the appendix in the Journal of Global Economic Analysis, and that appendix provides some simple R code and step-by-step instructions to aggregate estimates to a chosen GTAP aggregation. You don't need to be an R user to follow these steps. It's very the directions will lead you through step by step. But while a potentially useful starting point, in any global data set like this, there will inevitably be room for improvement and also the need for tailoring to suit the needs of specific research projects.
I think a really important contribution of the work that Alex presented is that it also makes available the full underlying database and the R code, which you can use to replicate or modify the econometric estimates. So this will really facilitate users drilling in to rework the data, the assumptions, and the econometrics as they feel appropriate. So, we hope that these two papers recently published in Journal of Global Economic Analysis will be useful for those of you interested in modelling NTMs using global models like GTAP. But we do encourage researchers to see this as a starting point from which they can develop appropriately given their own judgment or areas of focus. The modelling of NTMs, as most of us know, is very much an evolving field. There's lots of room for improvement in the data, the econometric estimates, and possibly modelling mechanisms. So we're very much looking forward to future developments, including from members of the GTAP network. Thanks so much for your interest. I'll pass back to Erwin's section now, in which he moderated the questions and discussion following the seminars.
We now open the webinar for questions. You could unmute yourself if you want. All right, Dominique.
I was applauding, but I do have some questions. One regards the technical barriers to trade, and I'm going back to Terry's example about the seatbelt. So the question is, what differentiates kind of standard domestic regulation, like a seatbelt, from a trade barrier? So, I mean, no country is going to remove the seatbelt requirement on imported cars without removing it on the domestic cars as well. So in what sense is that a trade barrier?
Yeah, no, it's I guess it's a non-tariff measure, but it's not a trade barrier. It's not a non-tariff barrier. And I guess that's why a lot of us don't remove NTMs completely. So, we do all this work on NTMs, but people have to realize they are NTMs, not necessarily NTBs. And there's a big distinction between an NTB and an NTM. And yes, my safety measure was that particular safety measure was probably something that's going to affect both and unlikely to change. I agree.
All right.
But you do have to consider that, yes.
Yeah, all right. The second question, Terry, has to do with the willingness to pay. And it jogged my memory. I think I had some email exchange with you in the past on this. And I believe I had a question about whether the price volume split could affect the measurement of the willingness to pay. Unlike, when you use the CES, for example, it doesn't really matter whether you price things in kilograms or in pounds. But I had the impression in your willingness to pay that the unit of measurement could actually impact your indicator. But it's going back a few years, and I don't remember whether we ever resolved that issue.
I mean, the way I'm not sure we resolved it either. The way it's implemented, I treat it's related with the E sub M. So the idea is it's supposed to be like a price effect. If you have a look at I'm not sure. If you have a look at the equation and how it's implemented, it is actually multiplied by the E sub M, which is a little different to how preferences are often done. So the idea was that it is supposed to be just like a price change. So if you think of this change, it then impacts the quantity demanded through E sub M. So I think I was trying to say think of it like a price effect. And if you go back, and basically I derived that in that paper by Miner and Walmsley. I actually derive where those preferences come from. So yeah, it's not like it's not like the preferences are sort of added on like the DP save and DPM. I've tried to make them like prices, and I think by including that E sub M, but I don't know whether that answers the question. And I guess
I'll have to
we'll have to revisit it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Terry.
Thank you.
And maybe I can make a brief comment too, Dominic, on your first question. In those UNCTAD databases, there is information collected by many of the contributors on whether it also impacts domestic products as well. But, you know, these rules and regulations, you're quite right. We definitely never want to get rid of all of the NTMs. And that's why I think that we'd never run scenarios where we go for 100% removal of them. We'd always go for some reduction, and that reduction might be quite different in different sectors. And that's where the expertise and the judgment of the researchers. But also, I think one thing that sometimes happens is, as you know, those of us who are CGE modelers will rely on the data. We'll grab some non-tariff measures, you know, some AVEs, we'll plug them into our model without really thinking through very carefully exactly where they came from and so on. And I think that's really something that that we hope that the contribution of the new database makes, is not just to give people an off-the-shelf. I mean, it does. It gives an off-the-shelf set of NTMs, which I'm sure some researchers will just plug straight into their model, and perhaps if they give it a bit more thought, they'll split them into exporter and importer effects and so on. But really, it's a pretty challenging area, and we do encourage researchers not to just, you know, that's a starting point, but really to dig in and to work out exactly what's going on in the sectors and the regions that are of interest to them. And those full UNCTAD NTM databases are available for a large number of countries now. So thanks for your comment on that, Dominique.
Yeah, I'm thinking, I'm not an econometrician either, Anna, so, you know, you have to forgive me. But if you're looking at price measures, for example, so an imported car is more expensive than the domestic car, but they're both faced with the same regulation, you couldn't assume that the price differences then is due to that regulation, right? Unless the cost of meeting the regulation is much more expensive for the exporter than it is for the domestic industry. For things like a seatbelt, I'm not sure you could make that argument. But yeah, I mean, you're right that it's good to understand what's behind the numbers. But I still, in the back of my mind, I'm still a little bit worried about these using these technical barriers to trade as necessarily a wedge that creates a price wedge for the imports.
Okay, I think we have room for one more question from anyone. If you have any burning questions. No? Okay, I think I just have one question. And for Anna, so I tried the scripts over the holidays. It worked fine, and it's easy to use. I think the only one Alex and you would need to prepare for is the new GTAP version 11 database, because the aggregation there is specific to, I don't remember if it's GTAP 9 or GTAP 10, but there would be some changes necessary to the R script just to update the aggregation mapping between the ISO countries and the GTAP regions, but that's very minor and very easy to do for Alex, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Erwin. And of course, the public release of version 11, I'm sure, is very close, on the top of your mind at the moment. So yeah, very much that's on the to-do list. Is we'll make sure that it's working with version 11. And if it's not working with version 11, we'll put a slightly modified version of those step-by-step instructions and so on in the sub files for the paper, so that researchers can use it with version 11. So thanks very much for that comment, Erwin.
Okay, I think we're ready to wrap it up. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us in this webinar. Feel free to download the 2 papers that were presented for a deep dive on the methodology. And we look forward to seeing you again in future GTAP webinars.